Hello and welcome to another episode of Coming Home Network Presents, where we have great conversations about all kinds of questions that people wrestle with when they're exploring the Catholic Church and wondering if they should become a part of it. I'm Matt Swaim, Outreach Manager for the Coming Home Network, and I'm excited every time to talk to a great couple of people and facilitate these conversations. If you're someone who's dealing with the issues like the ones we're talking about today, please do come check us out at CHNetwork.org. Come pay us a visit. We have tons of resources there. We also have an online community that you can join for free and have conversations with other people just like you, and that's community.chnetwork.org. And today we get to tackle a topic. It can be confusing to non-Catholics and, to be honest, a little bit scary for some non-Catholics, and that's the question of the communion of saints. Some Protestants believe Catholics are engaging in idol worship when they pray for the help of saints. Some Protestants may start to be opening up to this idea, but are kind of freaked out by the actual practice of it. So hopefully we get into some of that today. I'm very excited that today's two guests are people who have great stories about the saints and the roles they played in their own journey to the Catholic Church. Melissa Presser's with us, and if you want to see Melissa's story about her background in Judaism and evangelicalism and her whole story, she's been on the journey home, and you can find that episode on our website, along with a written version of her story as well. And of course, we've got Sister Julia Mary Darrenkamp from the Daughters of St. Paul, aka the Media Nuns, and you can find out all kinds of things about them at the Daughters of St. Paul website. Melissa, Sister Julia, thanks for accepting the invitation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today, Matt.
So, you both have fairly awesome stories about the saints, and we could take up the whole time with that, but I mostly just want to get sort of the snapshot of really the major factor that they played in your journey to the church, and then we can kind of unpack those stories. Melissa, why don't you go? Because yours, the first time I heard your kind of epic saint story, I was kind of floored by it. I know you were floored when it happened to you. I wonder if you could just briefly share a little bit about how the saints have, and this one saint in particular, was a major factor for you.
Yeah, so I converted to, I would say I had a major St. Paul conversion back in 2013, which is a whole separate story. I always say that I had a little detour in the Protestant church that I'm actually very grateful for. But I really felt like something was missing. And so at the time, I'm a writer, so I was blogging in real time about my faith journey. And I had somebody who I had made friends with, who also was a faith writer. She was kind of like a fallen away Anglican. And she emailed me and said, "You have to read this story about St. Edith Stein. She reminds me so much of you." And I said, "Who's that?" I really had no idea. What she did was she sent me 3 book recommendations. Books I'd never read before. I'm an avid reader, but books I'd never read before. And so I opened the first book, and I started just crying because there were 2 things that really stood out to me. Number one, Edith Stein, who was a Jewish convert to the church, for those of you that don't know, during the time of World War II, she had the same birthday as me. And her birthday was during the High Holy Holiday of Yom Kippur, which is the holiest holiday on the Jewish calendar, which is our Day of Atonement. The second thing that really stood out for me was the connection was that my grandmother, whose name was Adelaide, was my most closest person in my life. She was my best friend. She was everything to me. And sort of like the second sentence was like, and her grandmother Adelheid, which is the German name for Adelaide. And I threw the book down. I mean, it was as if the Holy Spirit was reading the book to me. And as I read about her story, it was so mirroring my journey in a way that was just so just inexplainable. And so she guided me, literally I felt, her presence just guiding me very, very slowly, really through the message of the Eucharist. And I was like, what's the Eucharist? And so kind of guiding me there. And I truly believe with all my heart that she's the one that led me into the chapel that day in a Catholic church, the first time I had ever been there, on my knees, praying before the Blessed Sacrament, not knowing what it was. And I know, just like I know we're sitting here today and I can see both of you and speak to both of you, that she was my guide into the Catholic Church because once I left that chapel after several visits, which, I entertain on my story on the journey home, I heard an audible voice say to me, Melissa, it's time to come home. So she continues to be my tour guide. She continues to be a valuable part of my life. And for anybody that doesn't know her, her name, also the name that she took is Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, so you may know her in that way. And she is just such an integral part of my story.
Yeah, I love that story. I'm so glad that you were able to share that. And like I say, in your written story and on the journey home, and both of those are CHNetwork.org. And Sister Julia, I know, among other things, you write for children, right? And I know that part of that flows out of your experience of the saints when you were a child, and they were that's one of the major factors for you coming into the church too, right?
My stories also of the saints starts with a book. And because I grew up in Pennsylvania, which there's not a whole lot to do back when I was 13 years old, we did a lot of reading. Myself and my girlfriend, we were both Protestants. I was a good practicing Protestant and she was not. But we read voraciously, and we came across two books, The Song of Bernadette and The Penitent, which was the story of St. Maria Goretti. And we were fascinated that there were people our age that were this heroic, and we wanted to find out more about them. So we went back looking for more books, couldn't find them, ended up finding a Catholic bookshop in Philly that had more of these books, and it happened to be the Daughters of St. Paul, believe it or not. So we got a bunch more saint books from them. But then we also made the connection because we were church hopping at that time. Back in the early 70s, none of the churches were locked. So right across the street from me was Sacred Heart Church. And all these books of saints that we were reading, they had stained glass windows of these people in the church. So in our little 13-year-old brains, we said, well, all of these people we're reading about, they go to Sacred Heart Church. So let's find out more about that church. And that's what really kind of, the saints were like the hook, into the church to find out more. I said, these people, I want to be like them. And they go to this particular church. So the sisters, actually, when we left with our stack of saint books, they gave us a catechism along with the saint books, and they kept in touch with us. So that's pretty much how the whole thing started. And I'm still friends with these particular saints today. Yeah.
So some pretty epic women saints have entered the chat, right? So we got Maria Goretti, we've got Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, and many others. And I have so many questions for both of you about kind of how these things played out over time. But I'm wondering, Melissa, because you came from a Jewish background, but then you became evangelical, I wonder, was there anything in Judaism that sort of prepared you for kind of an understanding of the communion of saints uniquely? And was there anything in evangelicalism that sort of like blocked you once you started to discover things about Edith Stein?
That's an interesting question because, in Judaism, that was part of my journey, was not understanding what was on the other side. But I always, Jews have very succinct and very particular death customs, and I was very interested in the way people died and burial and what happened after life after death. And so I had this kind of I guess it wasn't really an imaginary world, but I always thought that once we passed from this life to the next, that we did have that connection in heaven. And I would ask for guidance from relatives who had passed before, and there is this strong connection. So I wouldn't necessarily say, I think it was a mix of my curiosity, but also the respect I had for the process of death and dying, and the connection I felt to sort of what was on the other side of that, which was part of my journey. Interestingly enough, in the evangelical world, because they are, at least my journey, in my particular journey, I felt it to be very anti-Catholic, and that's actually what propelled me into the Catholic Church out of curiosity. One of the things that I think ended up propelling me into the saints was that having conversations with Protestants, they said, you cannot have a connection with the dead. It's against biblical teaching. And for me, because of the connection I had with my grandmother that was so strong, it really repelled me, because I said, well, how could that be? I know that she's in heaven. I have this connection with her. You're telling me I have to cut off this connection. And so it almost rebounded in a way. For some Protestants, they may have kind of looked at that and said, it's wrong, I'm not going to do it. But for me, I consider myself a rebel. And I said, well, they can't tell me that I can't have a relationship with my grandmother. And so that's actually what propelled me into going forward and looking at St. Edith Stein, because she had so many of these same conversations. She was a famous philosopher. She asked a lot of questions. She was so ahead of her time in her teachings on women and women in professionalism and philosophy, in really an area where women shouldn't have been asking questions that she was asking. And so because of that parallel universe, having a Jew talk to another Jew, it's almost like, we call it having another member of the tribe. Here's somebody else who sort of understands my journey and that connection with death and that connection with what happens after life, and looking at the saints in the way I looked at my grandmother when I would say, Nanny, pray for me, be with me. This was just another friend on the other side. And that's what I found in Edith Stein. I found a friend on the other side.
How about you, Sister Julia? When you went to Sacred Heart Church and saw that all your friends were up there in the stained glass, did any of your Protestant relatives get to you and be like, hey, now slow down here a second. That is a house of idolatry. Did anybody get to you on that? Or
They, my family, we were fine as long as I could go to any church as long as it wasn't Catholic. Really, any other Protestant church, and I couldn't understand that. But I think their big hesitation was that it opened up the door to Mary, to the Blessed Mother. And I think my first friendship with the Saint Bernadette she was the one who really introduced me to the Blessed Mother, and it was like love at first sight. So I wasn't willing to give that up. I didn't want to go halfway. I said, they've got her in this church. That's the church I'm going to belong to. But yeah, the saints, I agree with you, Melissa. They're friends on the other side. And the friends that I made with these early saints, Saint Bernadette and Saint Maria Goretti, when I was the same age as them, have stood the test of time. And I'm still friends with these saints. But along the way, you mature and you grow. And I just remember I didn't care for Saint Teresa the Little Flower because I thought she wasn't like the early Christian martyrs, But then I entered the convent and I said I needed a friend like that. So all of a sudden we were like fast friends, So as you go through life, you need certain supports, and even on like a purely natural level, you have all kinds of supports. You've got your family, your close friends, your siblings. You have teachers, you have mentors, you have people that you respect, but you're not really bosom buddies with them. So there's all different levels of friendship, even among the saints. So that's what I discovered. I might not be really close to Saint Jerome or Saint Augustine, but I certainly respect them as teachers or whatever. So I think we need to look at the saints in the same way. They're there to help us along our journey, just like our family is here.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so compelling to me too, is the variety within the communion of saints. For someone who doesn't know anything about the saints, you can look and be like, here's a rack of holy cards and all these people who are, cookie cutter people, right? And I think G.K. Chesterton says something about how all sinners are like shockingly boring and similar, right? The saints are like these like light goes through a prism, right, and shoots out, and each one comes out in a different radiant color. Like, sinners are not. I mean, whenever I fall into sin, I don't have any creative ideas, right? I don't have any I'm sure that like priests who hear confessions on a regular basis are like, well, never heard that one before. Like, that's probably never the case, right? But when you see sanctity coming out of somebody, it comes out in some like brilliant and creative, and holy and joyful way. And that's what I think is so compelling to me about the communion of saints. And of course, you've got the stories, you've got the quotes, right? And when it comes to a saint, you can say, here's what they said, here's what they taught. I find that interesting. It's that connection though, that can be a little scary for people. It can be, like I say, for a lot of the people we work with at the Coming Home Network who are coming into the church, they've read what the Catechism teaches about the communion of saints. They've, called up Catholic Answers or whatever. They've Googled, why does the church teach this? They've seen how it can be possibly provable from Scripture. But then there's the actual act of where someone actually has to say a Hail Mary out loud, right? Or they, want to ask for the help of a saint on a particular day. Was that weird for either of you? I'll start with you, Melissa, when you actually started to, because you had this experience, of course, with your grandmother, but after you'd read Edith Stein's biography, if I read a biography of George Washington, I don't start talking to George afterwards. You know what I'm saying?
I don't know. For me, it was like a million stars shooting in the sky. It was like this truth that was just sort of, I don't know, I'm sort of a rebel, and I think there's a lot of people out there who are, Maybe you're an atheist, maybe you've been into New Age. And I think that everybody's sort of searching for the same thing, even though they may not know it. And so it was this feeling inside of me, like there's all these people who are there because I really my whole search was really based on what happens on the other side. What is life after death? What is heaven? And what's the purpose of this life? And so I felt like as Edith was guiding me, she was sort of taking me to all of these other wonderful saints that I didn't know about before, that were just so incredible. And some, most of them not Jewish, obviously, but she opened my heart to be able to look at this variety of saints and this idea that you sort of have this cheerleading section in heaven that, when you're really in a bad space, right? And you feel like even you don't want to share your heart with somebody who's here on this earth because maybe it's something very personal. Or maybe you feel like you sound ridiculous, and you have this just variety, and I'd say cheerleaders in heaven, but that's the way I felt about it. Like in this space, I can look up the patron of whatever it was and pray a novena, or just find somebody that had something in common with me as an attorney, or as a writer, or somebody who had a St. Paul conversion, and just find them and say, you lived my life, you know my journey. Just like you said, nothing is new under the sun, right? Says the scripture. So it was sort of that same feeling, like it just opened up that a whole new world of what I was looking for. And so I think that's what the Catholic faith is about, right? It's like the Catholic faith is like the ocean. It's like the farther you go, the deeper you go, the more you discover. And that's really the beauty of the faith, it's just this never ending journey, except you're not alone when you found the communion of saints.
Well, you shouted out St. Paul, and since, Sister Julia, you grew up as a good Protestant, and you are a daughter of St. Paul, but you'd read St. Paul your whole life and heard him preached on your whole life. I mean, was it different and weird when you're like, I can talk to this guy?
No, it wasn't weird. Melissa, you and I should really have a conversation. This is so exciting that, it's true. It's like, it wasn't weird because the saints are real people. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I think the reservation or the block that most Protestants have is that, the holy card, the plaster statue, whatever, and the idea of idolatry. We're not praying to that statue. We're asking a friend who already made it, who's on the other side, who is really like St. Paul said, you've got a cloud of witnesses that are cheering you on and really want you to be where they are in heaven. So it's like, these are real people. And I noticed that, for myself personally, it's like you think that you're the one sometimes making friends with this particular saint. And I think it's the reverse. I think the saint is the one who extends the invitation. The saint wants to be friends with you. Why? Because they see that you're living through the same thing that they did, and they know what works. They know that what you need as far as all the things that you're missing, they've already gone through it. So and many people come in the book center and they say, well, how do you know what saints to be friends with? I said, well, you really have to read about them. You have to allow them to introduce themselves. Certain people you'll make the connection with and other people not at all. And then there'll be one that says, that person is a kindred soul. That person knows me. That, that particular saint really knows my life experience. And I think, if Protestants look at it in that way, and if they really read the letters of St. Paul, they'll see that, if you talk about the saints that you're living with today, and then they die, the connection is not broken because our life is connected with Jesus in Christ, so that it's not broken. If anything, it's enhanced by, being on the other side. So, and these people want to help us. These saints want to help us. So, my suggestion would be, read the lives of the saints, get a book on the saints and just go through it and see which ones, you feel a connection with, and then read further. Because, like Melissa said, it's an ocean that you never finish crossing. There's so much there. When I first became Catholic and first started reading these books, my biggest fear as a 13-year-old was that I would exhaust all the good books in the world. And I have to tell you now, after being in the convent 47 years, you will never live long enough to exhaust all the books that can help you and the saints that can help you.
I find that to be so completely true. And, of course, Melissa, you mentioned Edith Stein. She essentially picked you out, right? and this brings up, I think, another interesting question that, a lot of our members deal with as they're becoming Catholic. And, they've read a lot of apologetics books and maybe a little bit of church history, but they're overwhelmed because they look on the calendar and, if you get a good saint calendar resource, there's like not a saint per day on the calendar. There's like 40, right? So it's going to be like this overwhelming thing, like who's going to be my confirmation saint? I actually didn't get to pick one. It was part of my program. It just was not offered to me as an option. I felt so dumb afterwards. I was like, I would have picked one. So I stuck with Matthew because that's my name. Later on, the saint who has kind of tracked me around and like pops up in every corner I turn is Elizabeth Ann Seton for some strange reason. And that's another story. Actually, it's another whole series of stories for another time. But, for someone who's trying to, get into this, Catholic thing, maybe they're in RCIA or maybe they're thinking about becoming Catholic, and they're like wrestling with this process of like, how do I pick a confirmation saint? Like, do you all have any advice about like how you went about picking yours? I think I can guess, Melissa, who you picked.
Yes. So of course, that was not even an issue for me. And actually, being an attorney, I rallied around the catechism and used the catechism to make an argument to my priest to receive First Holy Communion on August 9th, which is that particular
Oh, really?
year,
I did not know that. That's awesome.
Yes, which is some tidbit of information I usually don't share, but it was Edith Stein's feast day that particular year, and I read the catechism and I read the canon law, and I made a good argument like a good attorney did before my priest, and I said, I can receive because I've been living my life as a Christian and I meet the qualifications of the catechism and such canon law. And after I got done giving my very poignant trial attorney summation, Father laughed at me and he said I would have said yes anyway. So I did receive, receive First Holy Communion in a line, unassuming that on a day in Mass that nobody else knew except the priest and I, and it was probably one of the most special days of my life. And received the remainder of my sacraments during the Easter Vigil. But another tidbit I would say to your question is my husband came into the church, my Israeli Jewish atheist husband, who followed me into the church, into our CIA the next year. He was actually wrestling with a saint, and I helped him find his saint, which was Saint Jerome. Saint Jerome helped with the Vulgate and the Bible and the language. And since my husband was coming from Protestantism, because he came with me, he was very, very, one of his things that he wrestled with, like most Protestants, was, the letter of the word and scripture, and had this just very reverent understanding of scripture. And I said, well, why don't you let Saint Jerome carry you in? Because that's how you sort of came in. And so they had a lot of similar characteristics, and so I helped him pick that confirmation saint for his entry into the church that next year.
That's awesome. I had a spiritual director one time recommend that I asked him if I had any saints for like this particular issue I was, going through, and it had to do with me, having issues with my temper and like various theological debates. And he's like, you should go to Saint Jerome. That was Jerome's issue too. So,
I wasn't going to mention that I love my husband, but yes, part of the personality was also with Saint Jerome. So that is also why I recommended Saint Jerome.
Again, the saints are colorful people. They're not like just like statues in the corner. But Sister Julia, any thoughts about how you picked your confirmation name, or any thoughts for like, that you might give to someone who's wrestling with that process?
I got myself a copy of the Lives of the Saints for Every Day. Now, mind you, I was only 13, so I didn't know exactly how to go about it. So I went down and I put my name with every single name on the list alphabetically. And for whatever reason, I decided to go with Regina. I don't know if there's St. Regina, but anyhow, I made my first communion on January 1st because the priest wouldn't let me make it on Christmas. So I said, well, let's start the new year the right way. So it also happened to be the feast of Mary, Mother of God. And I said, well, the Blessed Mother seems to be taking care of my decisions and choices, even when I don't know what I'm doing. So I selected Regina, and in our community, our devotion to the Blessed Mother is to the Queen of the Apostles, Regina Apostolorum. So I thought that was a happy connection. But so she's technically my patron saint, the Blessed Mother, but I also have really, really strong connection to Saint Mary Magdalene, really strong. So it's just, I don't know. I think, like I said, saints become friends, they stay friends, and then you grow and you mature and you meet other friends. And, but So the Blessed Mother was my choice without even knowing that she was my choice. But like I said, I still have connections with other saints that I consider my patrons too. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, you never run out, of exploring. I remember, one of the things that, was so fascinating to me when I was coming into the church was to look at the feast days, find a calendar, look up a feast day calendar and just see like the list of all the people and figure out what I could find out about people on a particular day. And even starting with like the A's, right? I laughed at your little alphabetical list, but like I would go through like saint directories and like go through the A's. And it was in the A's that it clicked for me, the whole idea of saint patronages. Why is it that like such and such is the patron of pig farmers and like such and such is the patron of like stonemason, like all the weird patronages, like people who have like gastrointestinal troubles go to this person, like, and it clicked with me when I got to Saint Apollonia, who is the patron saint of dentists and people with dental problems. And she, without getting too graphic, as part of her martyrdom, they like knocked her teeth out. Right. And then it clicked to me. It was like, okay, so who in the kingdom of heaven, who in the communion of saints is going to understand your dental problems better than anybody else? It's probably going to be her. Like, she gets it. She understands the feeling. Right. And, it also clicked with me, in reading her story, that that's really just what the cross is anyway. Like, imagine that Jesus had been, born into our century and crucified, or not crucified, but like, died in an electric chair. And then every church from here on out would have an electric chair front and center. And like it's crazy that we have like the most shameful moment, seemingly shameful moment in the life of Christ as like the symbol of victory for our entire faith. And yet that's what these patronages essentially are. Like, what's the worst thing that this saint ever went through? Well, that's what they're patron of. I mean, it just kind of makes sense. But I wonder, like, do you have any kind of closing thoughts for people who are in this situation and they just can't get over that hump? Like, they get some of the pieces of the Catholic understanding of the saints, but they're at a kind of a wall in regard to that. Sister Julia, I'll go with you first on this one.
Well, my thought is that everybody needs a friend. And as I said before, whether it's in the natural level or whether it's on the supernatural level, we need help. And the saints are the people that are willing to help us, eager to help us. They're like just waiting, for us to make that introduction, and then they'll snag it. But who would like say no to a friend? Someone that's anxious to help them. And I think we have to look at the saints not as inanimate plaster statues. These are real people. These are people who are now with God in heaven, and they're anxious for us to be there too. So I think, I think I would say I would make that suggestion. Get to know the saints and find somebody who's connected to you in some way, and get beyond the introduction, because they are so willing to help. And speaking of Saint Apollonia, there was the mother of one of our sisters. She would come in the book center. She was terrified of going to the dentist. So she would come in regularly and buy 20 holy cards of Saint Apollonia. Then when she went to the dentist office, she would hand them out to all the patients. So it's like, it was her way of helping that introduction. It's like, are you afraid to? Here's a holy card, So I think we just have to make that initial step, find somebody who has been in our shoes, who understands, who we can connect with, and take it from there, and then just have a conversation with them. Praying to a saint is the same as talking to a saint. Is the same as as we would speak to each other. That's the way I think we should communicate with the saints. Is in the same way, not with these and thous and with formal language, but as friends. And if we look at prayer in that way, then it's not so intimidating. It's not, we're not taking any honor away from God by talking with somebody who's already on the other side and who is willing to help us. And I think God put those people in place, just as He created us in a family. We don't come out of an egg, and we just don't stay by ourselves. We don't live on islands. We are born into a family. We have a support system. We have school. We have friends. We have, we have a whole system. So I think God wouldn't leave it like that just here. He has a whole support system for us, in heaven. And I think it would be silly not to take advantage of that gift as a gift.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a powerful image too. I mean, the church is the mystical body of Christ, right? And it's not like Christ has two mystical bodies. One's made up of dead people and one's made up of living people, right? It's all one body. And I think that's such a powerful image. You mentioned the dentist's office. When I got my LASIK surgery done a number of years ago, the guy who did it had a St. Lucy statue in his office, and she's the patron saint of anything having to do with eyeballs. Because, well, we won't get into that story, but let's just say she's got a good reason. But the other thing too is he mentioned that he had gone on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and his pastor had taken him to some of the major sites where Jesus healed blind people. And it just kind of reminded me that as I'm looking at, St. Lucy and the Communion of Saints and tying it back to the scriptures, that all this stuff is like stuff that really happened, right? And it's all connected to the great story. So, it's not like our faith is some like theory that we have to like intellectually assent to. It's like a real thing. So, Melissa, any thoughts from you on, somebody who can't get over that, that last hurdle regarding their, qualms about the saints?
Well, I think for me, I've been very vulnerable in telling my story. I really believe that's the only way to expose what you've been through. I mean, theology is great and I really enjoy studying it. But for me, even being, an attorney, somebody who went to school for a long time, really at the end of the day, for me, it was about my heart. It wasn't about theology for me. It was about my heart. And someone who, and I've shared this with the Coming Home Network, someone who's a trauma survivor, someone who has left. My best friend died. I shared that with you all as well, which was my grandmother. I wanted to know that there was a connection on the other side. And I do think, resources are great. Of course, counseling is needed and all the other great resources we have in the world of psychology, which I truly believe in. But I think in the spiritual realm, there are all these resources that people just don't know about. And when I visualize as a creative what that looks like from my heart, I almost imagine I'm reaching out my hand and there's a hand that's reaching back and pulling me out of that very, deep water that I was in for a very long time. That as much as I reached out to my grandmother and asked for her prayers, because I'm not praying to her, I'm asking her to pray for me, is the same way that I reached out to the saints and said, help me, pray for me. The same way that was a friend. So for anybody who's really, looking at it from a very dense theological perspective and really not willing to kind of look at it, in a more human factor, because we're not robots, right? We're human. To say, if you're struggling, keep your mind open because there are so many resources all around you, in the saints that just exposed me to help in my healing journey, in my trauma journey, and knowing that I wasn't alone here on the earth, especially now with what's gone on in the last couple of years. The saints have been an integral part of my journey. And I really hope by, being vulnerable and transparent and sharing, my story that other people will look at that and say, I'm going to give that a second look. I'm going to reach out to a friend. And that's really what it's about.
Yeah, it's, and the appeal that I would tack onto that, is that so many people watching this are connected with us at the Coming Home Network. And one of the ways they got connected with us is they watched the story of somebody who'd shared how they became Catholic. And there was something in the story that they watched that sounded exactly like their story, right? Well, the Communion of Saints is loaded with people like that. It's just loaded with people like that. And they're from every country, from every century, from every possible background and worldview, philosophy, profession, people who are parents, people who are widows and widowers, people who are orphans, people who were, everything, and you mentioned, it's controversial that Edith Stein was a Jew who became a Christian. Well, the deck was pretty stacked that way from the beginning, like all 12 of the first, inner circle of Jesus, right? Jewish converts, to him. So there's just loads and loads and loads. Man, this is great stuff. I'm so glad that both of you said yes to this morning. And before I let you go, Melissa and Sister Julie, I wonder if there's anything that you want to steer people towards, that you're working on, that people can find out more info about. Melissa, I know you've been doing a whole bunch of projects. Not all of them are yet ready for public consumption, but,
yeah, so I freelance write. We just started a great online writing community called missiodeicatholic.org. It is wonderful. You have your theologians, you have your sort of lifestyle authors. I consider myself in terms of dealing with real world issues. So you can find me on missiodeicatholic.org. You can also find me on Catholic Mom, and I write about all my fun and interesting life journeys. And I have a book in the works on my conversion story, the raw version, to share really with the world what my real story was, to really encourage people who have been through suffering, which is sort of my mission, in finding God in the dark.
Very cool. And we got links to those. Also, Sister Julia Mary, since you're a daughter of St. Paul, I know you have like roughly 5 million websites and social media accounts connected with your order. So what are the highlights for us?
Okay. Well, I don't have our particular website. I think it's paulinestore.org if you're interested in the books. I do have a book here. Of course I do, right? This one here, In Cielo et in Terra. And the reason I brought it along as moral support was it's 365 days with the saints. And I used to think that I knew almost every saint for every day. And then we came out with a book that had all the most recent ones canonized by the last 3 popes. So they were people that I had never heard of. So, and I'm always interested in making new friends. So that book was really excellent. And then I'm also pretty active on my Instagram account, which is SR Julia, and I'll put like the saint of the day, the newest Catholic books, that kind of thing. So what inspires me. So
Cool. Well, hopefully we got some graphics that steer people that direction. If not, check the show notes for this episode, and you can click on over and check out the great work, especially at Catholic Mom and through the Pauline Sisters and their store. And again, there's nothing more fun than following the Pauline Sisters on Instagram and Twitter, I gotta say. So, Sister Julia, Melissa, thank you so much. I encourage people to go check out CHNetwork.org. That's our main website with all of our resources, including Melissa's Journey Home episode and written story, and much more episodes of CH Network Presents. And of course, if you're looking for community, check us out, community.chnetwork.org. We got a great social network. It's closed. It's not connected to any other social networks. It's just a safe spot for people to talk through the stuff that they're going through on their journeys. So thank you so much, ladies. Have a wonderful day.